hostess, an admirable girl in most ways, a splendid companion, and a sound cook. The meal had been irreproachable, and in the phrase of the Signal, ample justice had been done to it. Julian was on the hostess's left, with his back to the window and to the draught. A good boy, a sterling boy, if peculiar. And there they were, all close together, intimate, familiar, mutually respecting, and the perfect parlour was round about them, a domestic organism, honest, dignified, worthy, more than comfortable. And she, Elizabeth Maldon, in her old age, was the head of it, and the fount of good things. "Thank ye," ejaculated Julian, with a queer look askance at his benefactor. "Thank ye, aunt." It was all he could get out of his throat, and it was all that was expected of him. He hated to give thanks, and he hated to be thanked. The grandeur of the present flattered him. Nevertheless, he regarded it as essentially absurd in its pretentiousness. The pipes were A1, but could a man carry about a huge contraption like that? All a man needed was an A1 pipe, which, if he had any sense, he would carry loose in his pocket with his pouch, and be hanged to morocco cases and silk linings. "Stoke up, my hearties," said Louis, drawing forth a gun-metal cigarette case, which was chained to his person by a kind of cable. Undoubtedly the case of pipes represented for Julian a triumph over Louis, or at least justice against Louis. For obvious reasons, Julie had not quarrelled with a rich and affectionate great-aunt because she had accorded to Louis the privilege of smoking in her parlour what he preferred to smoke, whilst refusing a similar privilege to himself. But he had resented the distinction, and his joy in the spectacular turn of the wheel was vast. For that very reason he hid it with much care. Why should he bubble over with gratitude for having been at last treated fairly? It would be pitiful to do so. Leaving the case open upon the table, he pulled a pouch and an old pipe from his pocket, and began to fill the pipe. It was inexcusable, but it was like him. He had to do it. "But aren't you going to try one of the new ones?" asked Mrs. Maldon, amiably but uncertainly. "No," said he, with cold nonchalance. Upon nobody in the world had the sweet magic of Mrs. Maldon's demeanour less influence than upon himself. "Not now. I want to enjoy my smoke, and the first smoke out of a new pipe is never any good." It was very true, but far more wanton than true. Mrs. Maldon in her ignorance could not appreciate the truth, but she could appreciate its wantonness. She was wounded. Silly, touchy old thing. She was wounded, and she hid the wound. Rachel flushed with ire against the boar. "By the way," Mrs. Maldon remarked in a light, indifferent tone, just as though the glory of the moment had not been suddenly rent and shrivelled, "I didn't see your portmanteau in the back room just now, Julian. Has any one carried it upstairs? I didn't hear any one go upstairs." "I didn't bring one, aunt," said Julian. "Not bring? I was forgetting to tell ye. I can't sleep here tonight. I'm off to South Africa tomorrow, and I've got a lot of things to fix up at my digs tonight." He lit the old pipe from a match which Louis passed to him. "To South Africa?" murmured Mrs. Maldon, aghast, and she repeated, "South Africa?" To her it was an incredible distance. It was not a place, it was something on a map. Perhaps she had never imaginatively realized that actual people did in fact go to South Africa. "But this is the first I have heard of this," she said. Julian's extraordinary secretiveness always disturbed her. "I only got the telegram about my berth this morning," said Julian, rather sullenly on the defensive. "Is it business?" Mrs. Maldon asked. "You may depend it isn't pleasure, aunt," he answered, and shut his lips tight on the pipe. After a pause, Mrs. Maldon tried again. "Where do you sail from?" Julian answered, "Southampton." There was another pause. Louis and Rachel exchanged a glance of sympathetic dismay at the situation. Mrs. Maldon then smiled with plaintive courage. "Of course, if you can't sleep here, you can't," said she benignly. "I can see that. But we were quite counting on having a man in the house tonight, with all these burglars about. Weren't we, Rachel?" Her grimace became, by an effort, semi-humorous. Rachel diplomatically echoed the tone of Mrs. Maldon, but more brightly, with a more frankly humorous smile. "We were indeed." But her smile was a masterpiece of duplicity, somewhat strange in a girl so downright, for beneath it burned hotly her anger against the brute Julian. "Well, there it is," Julian gruffly and callously summed up the situation, staring at the inside of his teacup. "Propitious moment for getting a monopoly of doorknobs at the Cape, I suppose?" said Louis quizzically. His cousin manufactured, among other articles, white and jet doorknobs. "No need for you to be so desperately funny," snapped Julian, who detested Louis's brand of facetiousness. It was the word propitious that somehow annoyed him. It had a sarcastic flavour, and it was Louis all over. "No offence, old man," Louis magnanimously soothed him. "On the contrary, many happy returns of the day." In social intercourse the younger cousin's good humour and suavity were practically indestructible. but Julian still scowled. Rachel, to make a tactful diversion, rose and began to collect plates. The meal was at an end, and for Mrs. Maldon it had closed in ignominy. From her quarter of the table she pushed crockery towards Rachel with a gesture of disillusion. The courage to smile had been but momentary. She felt old, older than she had ever felt before. The young generation presented themselves to her as almost completely enigmatic. She admitted that they were foreign to her, that she could not comprehend them at all. Each of the three at her table was entirely free and independent. Each could and did act according to his or her whim, and none could say them nay. Such freedom seemed unreal. They were children playing at life, and playing dangerously. Hundreds of times, in conversation with her coevals, she had cheerfully protested against the banal complaint that the world had changed of late years, but now she felt grievously that the world was different, that it had indeed deteriorated since her young days. She was fatigued by the modes of thought of these youngsters, as a nurse or mother is fatigued by too long a spell of the shrillness and the naivety of a family of infants. She wanted repose. Was it conceivable that when, with incontestable large-mindedness, she had given a case of pipes to Julian, he should first put a slight on her gift, and then, brusquely leaving her in the lurch, announce his departure for South Africa, with as much calm as though South Africa were in the next street? And the other two were guilty in other ways, perhaps more subtly, of treason against forlorn old age. And then Louis, in taking the slop basin from her trembling fingers to pass it to Rachel, gave her one of his adorable, candid, persuasive, sympathetic smiles, and lo, she was enheartened once more, and she remembered that dignity and kindliness had been the watchwords of her whole life, and that it would be shameful to relinquish the struggle for an ideal at the very threshold of the grave. She began to find excuses for Julian. The dear lad must have many business worries. He was very young to be at the head of a manufacturing concern. He had a remarkable brain, worthy of the family. Allowances must be made for him. She must not be selfish, and assuredly that serviette and ring would reappear on the morrow. "I'll take that out," said Louis, indicating the tray which Rachel had drawn from concealment under the Chesterfield, and which was now loaded. Mrs. Maldon employed an old and valued charwoman in the mornings. Rachel accomplished all the rest of the housework herself, including cookery, and she accomplished it with the stylistic smartness of a self-respecting lady help. "Oh no," said she, "I can carry it quite easily, thanks." Louis insisted masculinely. "I'll take that tray out," and he took it out, holding his head back as he marched, so that the smoke of the cigarette between his lips should not obscure his eyes. Rachel followed with some oddments. Behold those two away together in the seclusion of the kitchen, and Mrs. Maldon and Julian alone in the parlour. "Very fine," muttered Julian, fingering the magnificent case of pipes. Now that there were fewer spectators, his tongue was looser, and he could relent. "I'm so glad you like it," Mrs. Maldon responded eagerly. The world was brighter to her, and she accepted Julian's amiability as heaven's reward for her renewal of courage. Part 4. "Auntie," began Louis, with a certain formality. "Yes?" Mrs. Maldon had turned her chair a little towards the fire. The two visitants to the kitchen had reappeared. Rachel, with a sickle-shaped tool, was sedulously brushing the crumbs from the damask into a silver tray. Louis had taken the poker to mend the fire. He said nonchalantly, "If you'd care for me to stay the night here instead of Julian, I will." "Well!" Mrs. Maldon was unprepared for this apparently quite natural and kindly suggestion. It perturbed, even frightened her by its implications. Had it been planned in the kitchen between those two? She wanted to accept it, and yet another instinct in her prompted her to decline it absolutely and at once. She saw Rachel flushing as the girl industriously continued her task without looking up. To Mrs. Maldon it seemed that those two, under the impulsion of fate, were rushing towards each other at a speed far greater than she had suspected. Julian stirred on his chair, under the sharp irritation caused by Louis's proposal. He despised Louis as a boy of no ambition, a butterfly being who had got no further than the adolescent will to live, the desire for self-indulgence, whereas he, Julian, was profoundly conscious of the will to dominate, the hunger for influence and power. And also he was jealous of Louis on various counts. Louis had come to the Five Towns years after Julian, and had almost immediately cut a figure therein. Julian had never cut a figure. Julian had been the sole resident great-nephew of a benevolent aunt, and Louis had arrived and usurped at least half the advantages of the relationship, if not more. Louis lived several miles nearer to his aunt. Julian it was who, through his acquaintance with Rachel's father and her masterful, sinister brother, had brought her into touch with Mrs. Maldon. Rachel was Julian's creation, so far as his aunt was concerned. Julian had no dislike for Rachel. He had even been thinking of her favourably, but Louis had, as it were, appropriated her. From the steely conning tower of his brows Julian had caught their private glances at the table, and Louis was now carrying trays for her and hobnobbing with her in the